Bright lights, big city. Welcome to Toronto.
Great pleasure. Thank you very much for inviting me.
Can I call you doctor?
I'm a simple economist named Werner.
I promise you this is not going to be your traditional type of, hi, how are you, how's it going, what's the world like in your side of the world. We're going to get down to real discussion on climate action.
Yes.
So I want to show you something, and I haven't shown you this before, but can we put up on the screen an image? That I took on my cell phone a couple days ago. Now, those red marks are weather patterns, hurricanes, typhoons that are simultaneously hitting various shores of the world. That's an image from NOAA. I don't know, can you see that? You see a lot of red. So, the world we live in today is not about climate change, it's climate changed. And fortunately for us, you're the most important man in the room because the EIB has deployed over $1.2 trillion, 12,500 projects in 162 countries. They are the largest issuer of green bonds, and they do more towards sustainable development financing. So what I think I'm dying to understand, I'm sure everyone else in the room is understanding, is the climate has changed. How are we going to mitigate it further, and how can you help us finance that?
Well, we need you to finance that because there is no way that the climate goals that we celebrated 4 years ago in Paris or the Sustainable Development Goals of the United Nations celebrated at the same time can be reached without the attraction of capital from the private sector. This is not something that the taxpayer can shoulder. And this is why a close cooperation, a trustful cooperation on a high technical level with the private sector is unavoidable, and this is why the public sector must begin to speak the language of the private sector.
So multilateralism seems to be declining?
That's one of the worst facts that you can describe. Sometimes I have the feeling, and I've been in foreign affairs for decades, that we are presently forgetting everything we ever learned about diplomacy, about peaceful conflict resolution, and about the use of division of labor in international economics. I think we are really on the wrong track, and this will be will cost us very, very dear.
So, you can't do it on your own. We can't do it on our own. There's no room or time for politics. We see what politics are and how people have differing views on climate change or changed. What do you think we can do to help the EIB achieve its vision and mandate to ensure that there's a brighter future for generations to come?
It is politics, because without the support of the political side, we will not be able to do what we consider necessary. My institution is owned by the 28 member states of the European Union, the EU Bank, and without their support in the board of directors and the board of governors, I can't do anything. So I need to support them, and I've changed my rhetoric. I'm not talking about the risks of climate change anymore. I'm telling them that climate change, as you have seen on these pictures, is taking place. And they might have 12 years in order to at least slow down the process. Otherwise, it's probably too late. So it is a question of damage control and not damage avoidance anymore. And this must be made crystal clear. And that requires enormous investment. And these by the way, if we want to achieve the climate goals and the Sustainable Development Goals, we must exchange practically the entire capital stock by 2050. And
okay, well that's not going to happen realistically. So
it's realistic.
I'm not an engineer or anything, so I'm trying to have a realistic perspective here on what the future for our children and grandchildren are. So you're basically saying, in your perspective, your personal opinion, that it's politics is the only way. Politically motivated is the only way for us to really address the 2030 agenda or the Sustainable Development Goals in itself.
We cannot do it against the political class. We have to convince them, and they must see what kind of a responsibility they have. And that requires the provision of support for the generation of financial capacity. Since I believe it will be, to the large extent, private financiers who have to contribute to that, the political sector must provide the frame for that. This is what we are doing quite successfully in the European Union in other contexts of necessity to generate private money for public purpose. For instance, with the Juncker plan, we have overcome the investment crisis in Europe in the aftermath of the financial crisis by injecting a relatively small amount of public budget money as a guarantee facility, shifting it from subsidies to guarantees. These things can be done, and they have to be done on the climate side as well. We have been asked by the future President of the European Commission, Ursula von der Leyen, to trigger an investment volume for climate projects by 2030 at roughly 1.5 trillion Canadian dollars. And we will do that. We will do it.
Is that enough?
It is never enough, but it's an enormous dimension, and I think we are not the navel of the world, and we are not the only ones in the world, but I think the message is spreading.
But you are the largest lender to climate sustainable type projects. So really, I think the challenge is you have to lead from the front. So is there something EIB is doing or thinking of or has a vision of how they could lead the rest of the world to follow?
You have to be bold on this, because if you are not courageous and innovative, then you will not succeed. And by the way, innovative is the key word here. Don't believe that politicians should set technological standards. That should be really left to those who develop these technologies and bring the best ideas. But the frame for this must be given. And then the financing. On the financing side, I think we have seen a lot of openness of the private sector to participate. When my bank invented 12 years ago green bonds, my colleagues at that time, I was not there then, I was in foreign ministry at that time, but they were considered lunatics. That market has developed to more than $500 billion US by now. So there is the readiness also of private investors to go into these investments. And we are now, in close cooperation with Antonio Guterres, the Secretary General of the United Nations, into the issuance of bonds for other SDGs. We have issued the first ones 2 years ago for projects in the water sector. There it's relatively easy technically, but we are now moving also in the field of education and health. So the other SDGs should be observed as well, not just climate.
And you're talking about like poverty eradication, equality of rights, the protection of women and children. Yes, of course, but there,
of course it gets more difficult. If you say just poverty reduction, you have to be very precise, and the bonds that you issue must be extremely precisely defined, because you can't just take this piece of paper, paint it green, and say this is a green bond. You must give reassurance to the buyer of these bonds what you're going to do with that money. There must be accountability, there must be traceability, transparency. And this is very difficult to achieve. It requires a big, strenuous international negotiation process, because not in every green bond everything is green, and that must be avoided.
Okay, but it took so many years, COP22, COP21, COP22, 20 years to even get to the point of carbon tax or somewhat of a framework of an agreement in Paris. You were there, I was there. Do you really think we have enough time to sit here and try to figure out how to politically maneuver our way to issue bonds and finance these projects and recognize that we have a problem?
No, at the annual IMF meeting last year in Bali, I heard so many people celebrating our successes in the pursuit of the SDGs, including the climate goals, and I said, well, the fact is we are on the right track, but we are far behind schedule. So we certainly do not have the time. We have to act quickly. But we must also use the momentum. I don't know what the situation in the Americas is, but when it comes to Europe, this year we have had a fundamental change. This European Parliament election has been the wake-up call for the political class, because all of a sudden, those who continue to believe that climate change is something of minor importance have been beaten up. And therefore, everybody is now changing considerably, and you hear openness on the side of countries and politicians who have been very skeptical, even if they have not been climate change deniers, but they didn't see the urgency of the issue. This is changing, and therefore, we must come with these ideas now and come with concrete proposals.
So basically, we're not going to, what I'm hearing, and basically what I believe is, we're not going to be able to solve the problem. We have to make the runway longer, become more innovative, use AI-type technologies and other advanced technologies to find a way to replace the energy with cleaner energy, reduce the carbon emissions. I mean, what about funding a program that one day, every year, every human being over the age of 15 plants a little seedling on the planet. That would reduce the carbon by a little bit.
Every small step is a great idea, but we have to also be bold when it comes to big steps. Because we have to take into consideration that some beloved cities, maybe Venice, will not exist anymore 30 years from now. And the question then will be, is it going to Bologna as well? Where does it stop? So we have to move quickly. And therefore, in a situation like the one we are in now is an opportunity to move things forward.
So let's move forward. So you look at the population in the world today, and you have more people in sub-Saharan Africa and Southeast Asia that don't even have basic power, which, you know, arguably should be a basic human right, let alone water. Now, they've lived without power for most of their lives, so that's fine because they've adjusted to it. Not fine that it's acceptable, but fine they've adjusted to it, but they're not going to be able to live without water. So how do we use, or how does EIB view their role to helping these developing nations to launch programs to desal their water, to bring power, to run the machines, to help them just survive?
There is an enormous amount of good ideas there, but the fact is that we in Europe have woken up to the development challenge only because we had the shock of the migration crisis. Until then, lots of money was invested into developing projects, but more with a donor-recipient thinking and a charity attitude than with a strategy. And this has now changed because you can just look at the figures of Africa's population. Between now and the end of the century, it will triple. Between now and 2050, it will double. And at a time when technological change, artificial intelligence is also reaching Africa and jobs will have to be replaced. So we have to get into the gear with our job creation machinery, and that requires huge investments in Africa in the next years. And this has only just begun.
So jobs in Africa, but jobs require workers. Workers require nutrition, water, electricity. Solar is the greatest creator of jobs of any other form of renewable energy, correct?
But also the greatest helper for desalination. Look at what has been made possible in Mexico over the last couple of years because of the price of solar energy going down so rapidly. Availability of ground is there. So desalination becomes a possibility, serious one nowadays. And these technological advances must be used now. We must be more courageous in going into these fields. And also, let's be honest, on electricity in Africa, we have sponsored a big project in Congo and the border to Cameroon, roughly 40 million people living there. They have never had electricity there, with the exception maybe of a little.
So your project, that project is the first power.
This is a mobile communication project. That's the interesting thing. In that part of Africa, where you have never had electricity, you now all of a sudden have 4 million people with a smartphone. And we have set up a little forest of mobile transmitter stations, solar powered, very efficient, very cheap. And all of a sudden, these people have access to the mobile signals. And
that's where it starts, right?
In a part of Africa where inclusive growth has not been the name of the game so far, where, however, women are the main drivers of economic progress, they now have the mobile phone. And they have never had the opportunity to have direct access to information about health, education, and other things. And now they have even access to a bank account because they would have never been able to travel 300 kilometers to reach a bank station. So this is now a development that takes place even though a firm electricity net will not be established within the next 20 years.
That's the type of innovative thinking that helps certain parts of the world. I think that's absolutely fantastic what you're doing. We got about 5 minutes left, and what I really like to always do is have something that we walk away with, we leave. I think everyone in the room can agree the climate has changed. Some may agree on the varying degrees. So that's pretty established scientific fact. Climate has changed. Do you believe in your heart of hearts that we are going to be able to reduce the carbon emissions? Because you're front line and center. You see these projects coming. you're deploying billions of dollars every year. Do you think that there's enough projects coming online fast enough that's going to offset the carbon emissions in the atmosphere?
I'm fully convinced that the projects are there. They can always be made better. We can always help our clients with giving technical advice, advisory capacity to the financing part of our business. That is more and more important, no doubt about that, but the projects are there. The funding is there as well, because particularly at a situation when we are talking about zero interest rates and ample liquidity on the markets, it is possible if we help the investors to go this way. And there is one issue which for Europe is going to be key, and it's my firm conviction for what is left of what we used to call the West in North America as well. If we do not get more competitive in the globalizing world, and if we do not take the challenges of globalization head on, we will lose that competition.
Right.
I was in active politics and had the privilege of being part of the activities around the unification of my country 30 years ago. And then the overcoming of the division of Europe at that time. We won that Cold War. But why did we win it? Not only because our model of free rights, free speech, democracy, rule of law, human rights, and enlightenment was superior. That's what we believe, and I love to believe that. No, we won it because we were technologically and economically more successful. The next big competition with autocratic regimes in this world, we will not win via technological and economic superiority if we don't get better. And this is why innovation.
Survival is not a competition.
Sorry?
Survival is not a competition.
Yeah, you better have a competitive spirit if you want to survive.
So
that's what I wanted to say. When I listen to the fascinating talk about.
We can't drink water?
When I listen to this fascinating talk about artificial intelligence, and I believe there is an enormous amount of music and some also illusions, as we heard in this whole thing. I was wondering whether we're doing enough for natural intelligence as well. And if we neglect the necessity to innovate and educate, and sometimes that means not only educate in mathematics and in engineering and whatever, but also in history, then we lose the battle.
But
so if we want to preserve what we used to call the West, the community of enlightened, rule of law-based, human rights respecting democracies, we have to get better also economically.
I wholeheartedly agree.
Good.
You can't send the child to school without water, and child can't sit in school in 40 degrees Celsius without air conditioning.
This is why water projects for us are particularly important. We are active around the world with clean water, drinking water projects, but at the same time also with sewage. This is an issue that will get more and more difficult. And by the way, in this context, we also have to make sure that we modestly begin to clean up our rivers, because they are 90% cause for the pollution of the oceans.
So you're setting an example around the world for other investment banks, and let's give European Investment Bank a round of applause.
Oh, thank you.
What you have done and what you are doing as a leading investor in sustainability and sustainable infrastructure is you're showing that it can be done. Unfortunately, it's not enough. So we have about a minute and a half left. What would you do? Put the politics aside. You notice we didn't talk about Brexit because we discussed we wouldn't.
We talked about other stupidities, but...
But let's, if you had the opportunity to affect change, politics aside, how would you do that?
Basically, it comes down to the basics. Education, take care of the kids. Because they wake us up now. I had an event in Berlin before the European Parliament elections where, in my side capacity as president of the Institute for European Policy, had invited our president to an event with young people, youth organizations, non-political youth organizations, who had encouraged their peers to participate in this parliamentary election process. And I had said at the beginning, welcoming the president, Mr. President, you can see at the climate front that you can mobilize young people for political objectives. And he responded to that, well, Werner, you are completely right. We can mobilize them for political objectives, grand political objectives. But much more important, they will mobilize us.
So power to the people,
Yes.
The people will bring the power.
Yes, in particular young people.
Thank
In
you.
the past, in my past, when we talked about political long-term objectives of young people, we talked about the stability of the pension system and social security system. Which 21-year-old is interested in that? But the survivability of this planet, that is something you can get young people with.
You don't need a pension if we don't have a planet where we can drink water and go to school. Thank you very much for your insightful thoughts today.
Great pleasure.